I saw this week a report in the news that... See you later. I saw a report in the news this week that a woman who was cited for driving alone in the carpool lane argued that since she was pregnant and the law has been now changed, that she wasn't alone, and so it was permissible because she was driving with another person in a car. The state has now responded, well, the fetus was not properly wearing a seatbelt. And so this is going to go all the way to the Supreme Court. There's a lot of issues here. You know, religion and state is a very tricky subject. Separation of church and state, and though we say that we're for the separation of church and state, the merging of the two is very much part of our existence, and it's pretty hard to separate. It's hard to separate in Israel, and it's hard to separate in the diaspora. In Israel, you've probably been following along that the government has collapsed and they've called for new elections, but the government has, the cracks in the coalition started all the way back during Passover. And think about everything that Israel has going on now. With the Iranian nuclear war or nuclear weapons, with the Palestinians, with inflation. And the original crack in the coalition occurred over a debate on whether chametz would be permissible in hospitals during Passover. This is what started the crack of the coalition. I mean, imagine here if there was a decision that we wanted to start calling the weekend Sunday and Monday. So we would argue. We'd say, you can't do that. We'd say, why not? We'd say, because of church. And they'd say, well, there's a separation, so that's not an argument. I mean, how many calls do I get all the time that some teacher assigns something or some sports activity is on the first night of Passover or is during Yom Kippur, and so they say, you need to call the superintendent or the principal or whoever and tell them that Jews can't do that. And say, well, what's the argument? The argument is church. Well, do we separate church versus state, or do we use that argument when we need it, and as we should? So when Roe versus Wade was overturned, we see that our Jewish values could, and sometimes do, stand in sharp contradistinction to U.S. law. Now, what is the case? I mean, after Roe versus Wade was overturned, a lot of people called me and said, all right, well, what's the Jewish law? I said, well, tell me which side of the argument you're on, and I'll tell you a Jewish law that makes you feel better about it. Because the answer to abortion in Judaism is ze lo pashut. It's not so simple. And in reality, the Jewish law on abortion is to go case by case. Now, I'm not saying that's what we do in Reform Judaism. But according to strict Jewish law, if you really wanted to follow Jewish law, you have to look at every case in and of itself and then make a decision. So there could very much be a case where Jewish law says that an abortion is preferred or even required, and the state law says you can't do it. And now the Jew is in this position where American law stands in contradistinction to Jewish law, and you have a problem. It's not the first time in the diaspora over the last 2,000 years that this has come up. But there are some very interesting ways that Jewish law looks at secular law, especially in the diaspora. Over the last 2,000 years, there have been laws that have come up all the time that the goal of the law was simply to persecute Jews. And in that case, the rabbis ruled, you don't have to follow it. For example, there were times where they said, we're going to have a very special tax just for the Jews. And the question would be, well, are they going to enforce it or not? And is it going to bankrupt you or not? And what are the circumstances? Because if it's just a little amount of money and it's not going to hurt you too bad, then pay it and don't go to jail. But if it's going to bankrupt you, move somewhere else. Or try to do what you can to get out of it. But you're not required to follow a law that was meant for a persecution. And similar things have happened today. We've seen it recently, even as recently as this year, where in countries such as Sweden or Switzerland or Iceland or New Zealand, they've made shechting or slaughtering kosher animals in a kosher way illegal. Or they've made circumcision illegal, saying that it's cruel. And rabbis who look at the facts say, this qualifies as Jewish persecution. It's the only reason that they're doing it. There was even a movement in California to ban circumcision. And so the rabbis would say, do what you can. And there are Jews living in places like Switzerland and Sweden where they have to import their meat, or where they have to take their kids to another country to get them circumcised because it's illegal. Most of the men will tell you here, we got through it okay. It wasn't so cruel. But they're very sensitive in Sweden. It doesn't happen so much here, but it has in our past through American history. In the 1860s, when Ulysses S. Grant was general, he came through Kentucky and Tennessee and declared that Jews should be expelled from those states. Many of the Jews didn't hear about it because most of the telegraph lines or whatever they had were down because of the war. And they've been knocked down in the fighting. One Jew, a man named Caesar Kaskal, who lived from Kentucky, got on his horse, rode to Washington, D.C., found a congressman from Ohio who was sympathetic. They got in to meet President Lincoln, and Lincoln immediately revoked the expulsion order. But even in this country, there have been, throughout its history, laws that were meant specifically to persecute the Jews, in which Jewish law would tell you, in such a case, don't follow the law of the state. Now, the main Jewish concept that governs this idea is something the Talmud teaches us called Dina de Malchuta Dina. In theory, you may have heard of this. But what Dina de Malchuta Dina means, it's a principle of Talmudic thought, which means the law of the land is the law. So, if you look in the Torah and it says, I don't have to pay taxes, and you call the IRS and tell them, it's in the Torah, I'm not paying my taxes, you're going to jail. No. And there's nothing I can do in that case to help you. But Dina de Malchuta Dina, the purpose of it, the law of the land of the law, means that Jews have to accept the social contract of the land that they live in, provided that it's moral. And the hope was, according to the rabbis, especially when you consider that non-Jews are bound by what we call the Noahide laws, that non-Jews in essence have to follow the Ten Commandments, that if you're going to live in what presents itself to be a moral country, then Jews are required to follow the law of the land. And so, when you think about Roe versus Wade, you have to decide what is the law of the land, and do you have to follow it? There have been other cases, though, that look at it a little bit differently. There was once a case where etrogs for Sukkot became very expensive, and they couldn't get them, and they were so pricey that in the 1500s, Rabbi Joseph Caro, who wrote the Shulchan Aruch, which is the definitive law and the code on Jewish law, said you only have to spend 1/5 of your income on that year on your etrog. So, remember the etrog, the yellow thing? So they can be pricey. So, if it was going to cost you so much, if the cost to follow the mitzvah was so pricey, then he said you don't have to do it. In which case, if the cost of following the law of the land is so pricey, then maybe you don't have to follow it. And what I'm trying to point out right now is that when state issues and religious issues merge together, what Jewish law says is it's very complicated. It's very difficult to necessarily make an argument, and you have to look at it case by case. I think Roe versus Wade brings this issue to the forefront for us. We have our Jewish values. Some of them we are incredibly passionate about. And that's probably why so many people called the clergy to figure out, well, what is the Jewish view on abortion? And so we could maybe use this case to put it in a more proper framework that gives us perspective on what it means to be a Jew in the diaspora. But before I explain that, let's just think about this idea. In Judaism, the goal of the Torah, the goal of being Jewish, the point of being Jewish, is to see if we can bring heavenly and spiritual values into our material world. Can we sanctify the mundane and elevate it to holiness? Can we say the motzi so that our food becomes not just subsistence, but a gift from God? Can we offer prayers and blessings daily and consistently in order to recognize all of the gifts that we take for granted? Can we treat each other as we would want to be treated and recognize that we're all created in the image of God? This is the goal of the inspired Jew who recognizes what the mission of the Torah truly is. The Torah came from heaven to Mount Sinai as a gift of spiritual substance, meant for us who live in a mundane world to try to sanctify that mundane world. So for the Jew in the diaspora, I think the challenge is similar. Can we bring the light of our sacred tradition to a world that's not governed by mitzvot? You've heard the expression, to be a light unto the nations. Actually, what it says in the Tanakh is le'ur goyim, to enlighten the nations. So when people ask us to comment about the American Jewish experience, we tend to think not too much further than bagels and Seinfeld. Bagels and Seinfeld, right? But we might think as well of Abraham Joshua Heschel, who marched arm in arm with Dr. King, and the Jews who were on the ground helping to form the NAACP. We might think of Caesar Kaskel, who rode his horse to D.C. to appeal to President Lincoln because a law that was put into law in this land was immoral. We might think of someone like Elie Wiesel, a professor at Boston University, who lobbied president after president to halt the genocides in Rwanda and Yugoslavia. At our best, American Jews don't necessarily separate religion and state. We're at our best when we incorporate the wisdom of our tradition into ways that better our American society. Now, Roe versus Wade will be debated for generations. But we Jews who accept both the unique wisdom of the Torah and the social contract of the United States ought to recognize that our best contributions to this country come when we stand up for our divine source of wisdom and find ways to merge it gracefully, morally, and appropriately with the values and laws of this amazing country that we are privileged to live in. There are times, and there will be moments, just like Caesar Kaskel, when we must scream from the rooftops and say, what is happening here is immoral to us. We have this incredible source of wisdom We brought the world the 10 Commandments. And there are concepts and precepts in those words that we would like to share with our fellow Americans. I pray that we continue to use our divine source of wisdom to help us elevate the mundane nature of our country into the holy place that it can be. Ken Yehiratzon. May it be God's will. Amen.